I have a colleague in today's interview, and her name is Dr. Mary Peters. And Dr. Peters is a faculty member at OSU, as well as the contributors of the FIP project with Battelle for Kids. Very good to interview her. Not only is she a colleague, but a friend. Insight into what the FIP is, and as you go through the modules. So welcome, Mary.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a faculty now at OSU, but before that, I've had several positions. But one of the things I think I want people to know is that as a special educator, and then as a person who worked at the Ohio Department of Education, and then later at a nonprofit, a lot of my work was around accurate assessment, and especially assessment that was designed to enhance teaching and learning. So one of my jobs was as an assessment director in Westerville City Schools. And then following that, I worked at this nonprofit, as I said, Battelle for Kids, wherein we got a big grant from the Ohio Department of Education that was funded through the federal government through what was called Race to the Top. And with those dollars, Battelle for Kids and ODE created a set of tools to help teachers build their assessment literacy, if you will, to help them develop a set of strategies around what we call formative instructional practices, FIP.
Well, thanks, Mary. Can you describe what FIP is?
Sure. So we've known for quite a while that when teachers are evaluated, that the problems of their practice tend mostly to be in the area of classroom assessment. And what we wanted to do was to help build teachers' skills in that area. So with these Race to the Top dollars, we were able to create a project around delivering online modules, some face-to-face professional development, and tools to help not only individual teachers, but schools develop an orientation to instruction and assessment, and basically the marriage between the two of them. So that was the work.
Okay. And can you tell us when FIP was created and about how many people have actually used it since its creation?
Sure. I believe we got that grant in 2011 to start, and it was a 4-year grant. And we have had almost 500,000 folks who've been involved in the modules in various ways. That is, we have teachers and schools and even full districts that committed to completing series of modules. We've had faculty like you and about at least 34 other faculty who have been using these modules with students at the pre-service level or certification level. So there was a real push, especially for those districts that got Race to the Top funds, to really fully engage. Not just take a module and be done with it, but really to work on the process of how do we think about the ideas behind formative instructional practices and implement them fully in a school-wide way, and where leaders support teachers' development of these skills.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten over the years for people that have gone through the different modules?
Well, actually, we've got really nice feedback. We not only worked in Ohio, but we worked in Georgia and in other states creating similar modules. And so by and large, we get great feedback. The idea was, as I said, not just to create a series of modules so that, you take it and then you forget about it. The real idea was to try to think about how to support a change in teacher practice. How do teachers incorporate new ideas into their learning? And that's actually very difficult, because, well, there's a lot of reasons, right? One is time. Where do I get the time to introduce and get good at new practices? And how does those practices get reinforced by my supervisor and by even my students in my classroom? So we got not only feedback about the modules, but we also about the change in practice that occurred as a result. We were able to produce videos where teachers enthusiastically were showing us what they were doing and what they were accomplishing and how really they transformed the nature of what was going on in those classrooms as a result. And that's what actually was the most thrilling part of it all.
And personally, I can say that I've used the modules in my class, this particular class, for a few years, and I've gotten fantastic feedback from the students. It really opened their eyes to what assessment specifically is. They've heard this term, but they really didn't understand it until they went through the modules, and they were away by how good they were and how it really explained. And then when they were going out in the schools, they started seeing things that they weren't aware of before they had gone through the modules. So
great.
I can say that, that's why I've continued to use them. Not only are they good and well developed, but I really feel that they have students a real understanding assessment is specifically, again, formative assessment is. One of the terms that you, in the modules, targets, can you talk a little bit about what those actually are?
I didn't hear part of that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Learning targets is
Sure.
used throughout many of the modules. Can you talk a little bit about what are?
Absolutely. So when we describe formative instructional practices, we describe basically 4 big ideas. And they really are based in evidence-based practice. You can find other people's work, not just the work that's referenced in the modules, but for example, there's an author that's gaining a lot of attention right now. His name is John Hattie. And John has been using meta-analysis. What he's showing is, so we've got 50 years or so of research, what really works? And among his top strategies that work are things like the very things that we talk about in FIP. So the first thing we talk about is clarity of the learning intentions. Hattie talks about this too. What does that mean? That means that we need to know, students need to know exactly what it is that they are learning. Teachers need to know what the standards are saying to them in terms of what students need to know and be able to do. And we also need to think about what is the success criteria. In other words, what does that look like? It's one thing to see a standard statement. And when you look at the standards, you have to ask yourself, what does that learning actually look like? How would I organize instruction? Because the standards were not defined that way. The standards are really these overarching statements. They're not teachable and they're not accessible. What we teach and assess to are targets. So we need to be really clear about creating targets that are from standards that help us break down what those standards actually mean so that Now what we can do is now we can organize instruction. Now we can prepare to assess. Now we can give feedback. And now we can help kids understand where they are in their learning relative to the expectations that we have for them so that they can see themselves on a path to mastery. So it turns out that this idea of clarity of the learning targets, creating clear learning targets that are communicated to students in important ways, that is, ways that they understand it, is really at the very center or the very foundation of formative instructional practice. Because if you don't have clear learning targets, what are you assessing?
It's almost like this, especially new and novice teachers, a way to plan their lessons. A lot of them observe that assessment is something that happens. Really talking about assessment is really an important piece process. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You know, assessment's got a bad rap right now because the way we look at assessment is we think of it as being a test. But if we think about it differently, then we're going to have a different orientation to it. So when we think about assessment, we talk about collecting and gathering and responding to accurate information about where students are in their learning relative to where they need to go. So really then, if we consider it that way, on an ongoing daily basis, teachers need to be actively collecting that information. How do you know where each of your students are? Do you have the tools, do you have strategies that you can use that are they do not need to be tests? They can be formal or informal ways, but they need to be planned. So to your question, when you're planning a lesson, some people start with what's the activity? And I'd argue you don't start with the activity. You start with what is the end in mind? What do you need kids to know and be able to do? How would you know that they've achieved that? That question, that's an assessment question. Then what are the activities? What are the learning events that you will craft so that you can actively collect and document evidence based on your instruction? So we have to really turn this around, right? The fact is that we just don't have kids do stuff. What we do is we have kids engage in learning events that give them opportunities to grow and to demonstrate their progress.
Another term that is used a lot are core components. To us, what those mean in the terms of the fit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really the first one was clear learning targets. That's the first component, because without that, everything else falls apart. The next one is collecting and document evidence of the learning. So first we need to, like I said, have learning targets. Then we need to ask ourselves, what is the evidence that we have that kids are being able to attain those targets? And then we need to say, okay, based on where they are, based on the evidence we're collecting, what kinds of feedback do we need to give kids? So feedback is the third component. Now we hear this term feedback all the time, and we use it in our language to mean everything. Everything from I love your shoes to quit that, to good job, really nice job, super, yay. But that's not really what we mean by feedback. What we mean by feedback is what are the ways that we communicate to students where they are in their learning. We need to give them success feedback to let them know that they're on the right path, and we need to give them intervention feedback to know what they need to do differently so as to be on the right path and make progress. So the third component is the use of effective feedback relative to those learning targets. We're not giving kids feedback about whether or not they came to school nicely dressed or they came on time or any of that. We really need to focus our feedback on the progress being made relative to those targets. And the last one, which sounds easy, but I find is the most difficult one, is this idea of student ownership. So student ownership is the last idea. So when you think about it, a lot of times what we're doing with students, in fact, I observed a student teacher this morning, and I asked her, how do this child know he's making progress? And she didn't really have an answer because she was monitoring this student. She was collecting and documenting some evidence, but the child was not in the loop. He had no idea whether or not or why and if he was making progress. So when we talk about student ownership, we need more than we're engaging students, then they're participating, we're giving them choices, we're attending to their interests and their learning styles. I don't really mean that at all. What I mean is, how do students know what the learning targets are? What are the learning intentions for them? Do they have a sense that this is achievable, that they can do it, and that they are motivated to achieve those targets? Do we have ways for them to collect and document their own learning? How are they self-monitoring? How are they keeping track of the fact that they're not just doing stuff, that the things that they're doing, the learning events they're participating in, the work that they're showing is actually evidence of their progress? And last, how are they using feedback? As owners of their learning, do they know how to accept feedback? Do they know how to use feedback? Do they know how to give feedback? Do they know how to ask for feedback? So that really is the 4 components. So FIP is always student-centered. So without this idea of student ownership, then it's really not formative practice at all. Okay, so it's very difficult. But we're used to being very teacher-directed, and we're not used to thinking about student ownership in important ways, helping students be participants in crafting learning targets, managing and knowing where they are relative to those targets, collecting and documenting their own evidence, and using feedback to give themselves the direction or the understanding of what comes next in their learning to proceed.
Another term that is frequently used in education, and it's also seen in these modules, is research-based practices. A little bit about that and how that the
Sure.
development of the modules.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of practices out there, and there are a lot of fads in education. So sometimes teachers will come into a new school year and all of a sudden the principal says, you know what, we're all going to do a book study and we're going to read How to Teach Like a Pirate or How to Teach Like a Bandit. Oh, wait, next year we're going to focus on positive behavioral supports. Oh, wait, next year, you see what I mean? But you have to ask yourself, why do we keep on doing this? Aren't there practices that have been known to be effective? And for whom are they effective? The strategies associated with FIP are not only shown to be effective for typical learners, they're also shown to be effective for students with disabilities, which is very important because we're talking about inclusive settings, right? And so what we want to know is, what are those practices that get the biggest bang for your buck? As teachers, your students, you all who are watching this, should be thinking about, I only have so much time. My students only have 180 days a school year. What strategies am I going to use that I know if I use with good fidelity, meaning the way it was intended, are going to help me get the biggest growth for my students that I can? Isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we all should be thinking? What are they? They can't be 6,000. They can't be strategies like teaching like a pirate or whatever. There's got to be a core set of practices that have shown to increase or accelerate growth of students. And in fact, there are. And the ones that I just described get high effect size, meaning that they promote more than a year's worth of growth when used well and consistently. So what are they? Turns out they're clarity of the learning intentions, clear learning targets, the use of formative assessment to promote student learning, meaning for students, not for grade books, not for using as some sort of behavioral strategy, meaning that we're going to use this information to shape and inform our instruction. But we have to be responsive to that information. We just can't do it. We need to use it. And then feedback. We know that if feedback gets really high effect sizes, when in fact it is not just immediate and timely and specific, we know that. But what we don't think about is it working for our students? And how do we adjust our feedback around the targets so as to move the learning forward? So we know that is a research-based practice. And then finally, we know that when students are highly engaged, when they feel like they have ownership of their learning, when they know where they are, know what they need to do, and they believe that they can close the gaps for themselves and with their peers, we know in fact we're going to get high effects, meaning we're going to get greater than a year's worth of growth with kids. So that is why these 4 practices are so fundamental to formative instructional practices, because they are in fact all highly research-based practices that when working together create a system in a classroom that really does move the learning forward.
Mary, I want to bring it now to specifically to Ohio. There's a mention, exactly where it's mentioned or how it's mentioned, TES. How does OTES and FIP work?
Sure. So we worked together with the Ohio Department of Education when we were developing these modules, and in fact create crosswalks. As I mentioned earlier in this talk, we knew from evaluation data that had been done nationally and in Ohio that where teachers tend to struggle was in the area of assessment. And if you look at the standards for teachers, you'll see that there isn't a whole area of about 5 competencies that are related to classroom assessment. So the combination of OTES and FIP, when you compare them, as I said in a crosswalk, shows that in fact, when you're working on FIP, you are working on the requirements relative to teacher competencies in the state of Ohio. So that's really important. So not only are you working on these practices to improve the learning for your students, you're also developing your professional competencies relative to things that Ohio believes are important.
And how does it connect to the Ohio standards then? Because I'm sure some of the people watching this are now a little bit confused because there's things like the competencies and then there's the standards.
Yeah.
How does this all work?
Yeah, so OTES are the standards for the teaching profession, the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System. And that system includes a set of standards for teachers. That is how teachers are evaluated. So when a principal comes and observes the classroom, they need to be scoring teachers on a rubric that is directly related to the standards for the teaching profession. Among those standards are things like understanding diversity and understanding classroom management and understanding good instruction, good assessment, having good relationships with families, good communication skills, good professionalism. So when I talk about OTES, I'm talking about the evaluation system that is based on the standards for the teaching profession. Okay? And so clearly, classroom assessment, formative assessment is included as a key component among those standards.
Thank you. One last question. Since this course is designed for new teachers, they're student teachers, or they will be entering student teaching soon, would you give them for their first steps when it comes to assessment?
Wow, that's a great question.
I know I'm sorry to put you in a corner.
I think that's a great one, because I focus a lot on accuracy and use. So what do I mean by that? I'm sure as students, you have all had the opportunity to take assessments, and you walk away and you scratch your head and you're like, I don't get it. I thought I studied for this. I thought I was prepared for this. This is nothing like I studied for. I don't even remember when he or she went over that in class. Did you read that? You know that story, right? That's because the test did not align with, or clearly align with, the learning targets for the students. So we shouldn't have our students, that is, as student teachers going into the field, do you want your own students to suffer under the same kind of conditions that you did as a student? Assessment should not be a surprise. It should not be a gotcha. It should not be a punishment. Hey, you weren't paying attention? Pop quiz. Hey, you know what? You handed this paper in late? Let me take points away. Not neat, points away. Punctuation, points away. So you see how we can use assessment? We can use assessments to have them as gotchas. We can as mystery kinds of examples of our work. How many of your students have walked away saying, I really know more than this? This was not a good example of what I know and I can do. Well, what I really think is most important is assessment, is to get away from the idea that assessments are not transparent, that we can't engage our students in this, that everything needs to count for points. So I think I would leave the students with the idea that we need to make sure that we use assessments frequently, not less frequently. We need to use them and be mindful of where students are in their learning. We need to share that with students. We need to make sure that we don't use gotchas. We need to make sure that we're not using assessment as weapons. We need to make sure that if we are going to assess kids, that we are assessing them accurately. That is, the information we are getting is helping us make the right instructional decisions. We are giving kids the right kinds of feedback. We're helping them get on the path or verifying their learning. So all of this takes time. You get better at this as you go along. But you have to really walk in there with an orientation that assessment is not a bad thing, that assessment is actually a really important thing. And that when you are really looking hard and when you're actively collecting and document evidence for the learner, then you start to think about all of this in a very different way. And that really starts laying the groundwork for your career. Because once you go there, then you start thinking about your role as a teacher differently, the role of student differently. And that really transforms a lot of the ways that you're going to approach your classrooms.
Well, thanks, Mary. As again, your insight not only to the FIPS, but as well as assessment and just teaching and learning in general is just fantastic. I wish that learning how to be a teacher I had, but that was such a long time ago. Assessment was considered a weapon rather than something that was informative not only for the student, but for the teacher and the parents and other important people in the kids' lives. And for providing this valuable information for me as well as my students. And have a great rest of the day.
It was my pleasure. Thank
All
you.
right, you take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.